No, we're done talking about the marathon. Where do my glasses go? What? Oh, yep. Good call. Good call.
We are getting close.
In the gym. All right, here we go. So, when we talk about graphing, we're going to talk about 3 attributes today. We're going to talk about amplitude, period, and phase shift. The first one I'm going to talk about is amplitude. Amplitude is always positive. Isaac, turn off your music. Isaac, turn off. Yes, we can all hear it. So it's always positive, and it only applies to sinusoidal curves. And that's a fancy word for sine and cosine, right?
Yeah, because I can, like the P runs to whatever. What is that?
Where?
Is that a D or a?
S-O-I-D-A-L.
All right, Marcus. Was that one word? Or
That's one big old word.
It doesn't matter, guys. It's not going to fly.
It's all good. So that big word that we just had this discussion about, the distance between them, that means sine and cosine curves, okay? It's half the vertical distance. So it's always positive. It only applies to the sine and cosine curves. It's the distance from the midline to the max or the min, which I'll explain in just a second. And it's the absolute value of the coefficient of the sine of x or cosine of x. And so that means it's the absolute value of the number that's going to be in front of the sine or in front of the cosine. And so what that would look like is this. Y equals 2 times the sine of x. So the number that's in front of the sine is the amplitude. This is positive, so the amplitude this time is 2. So what this looks like on a graph is this. So if I graph the sine starts at 0 and it ends at 0. And what's the maximum and minimum of the sine graph? It's 1, right? The original because it's on the unit circle. So if this is 1 and this is 1, so this comes up to the maximum and down to the minimum at 1. So my curve looks like this. So in this instance, because it starts at 0, my midline is the axis. And by midline, I mean the point where the 0 lies, okay? And so the amplitude is from the midline to a maximum or the midline to the minimum. Yeah. So if I was going to do 2 times the sine of x, 2 times the sine of x, what's my new maximum? 2. So it would be positive 2 and negative 2. So this would be here and this would be here. So my new curve would look like this. Good. It'll be easy then. Okay. Okay. So the amplitude is always positive because it's distance, and it's from the midline to the maximum or the midline to the minimum. Now, one thing, so what you want to remember, right? If it's a 2 here, that's a 2 from the midline to the maximum. It's not 2 total. It's a 4 total, right? Does this make sense? So midline to maximum, midline to minimum. So if I said this, I want to know what the amplitude is here. What's the number one thing that we wrote down under amplitude? Look at your paper. So what is the amplitude here? So it's 1. And so if it's 1, what does that negative mean? It's a reflection, right? It flips it. Amplitude has nothing to do with which way the sine or cosine is oriented. Amplitude is the distance from the midline to the max, midline to the minimum. This is a reflection. The amplitude is still 1. It's just upside down. Okay, so that's amplitude. Number 2 is the period. So I'm going to give you the formula that you're going to use all the time. I'm going to give you that first, and then I'm going to do some definitions for you. But this is the most important thing for period. This is going to be the normal period divided by so this is how you're going to find period. That's the actual formula. So the period's always positive. What else is always positive? Amplitude. And what the period actually is, it's the horizontal distance needed to show one cycle of a graph. So there's going to be 2 different ways to look at this. We can look at it with degrees and radians. Degrees and radians. The first one I'm going to write down is radians. I'll come back to his question when I'm done. So if I'm writing it in radians, I'm going to write it with an X. If I'm going to write it with degrees, yes, for period. If I'm going to write it in degrees, we're going to use a theta. And the way you can remember this is in degrees. So the period in degrees is 360. So you can remember the theta has a circle and the degrees has a circle. Okay? So if you see a theta, it's going to be in degrees. If it's an x, it's going to be in radians. And so radians would be 2 pi. And the tangent is only half of that. It's pi and 180 degrees. Hey, on the amplitude, y'all, go back and write this so you don't forget. But since on the tangent function, we have asymptotes, there's no amplitude. What? On the amplitude. Yes. So this is what it'll look like. Yeah. What?
Do we copy what you're writing down right now?
Yes.
So that's for amplitude, right?
This is for period now. Right? Okay. Look, I said just go back and put this under the amplitude. And I'm still writing under the period, like straight through. Yeah. This was amplitude, and this is period. Oh, yeah. Yeah, you just keep writing. I just wrote big enough you guys can see. Okay. Okay, so y equals sine of 2x. So the 2 is not in front of the sign, because if it's in front of the sign, that's amplitude. If it's in front of the x, that's the coefficient in front of the x. So first of all, is that degrees or radians? It's radians, because there's no theta. Very good. So the period for sine and cosine are both 2 pi or 360, and then the tangent is 180 or pi. So the period is going to be, we take the 2 pi, and what's the number in front of the x? So I'm going to divide, so the 2's cancel out, so the period this time is pi.
Is that where it's like coefficient of theta or x? Okay.
So this time I have the cosine of theta over 2. So this time it's in degrees. So it's 360. And what do I divide by this time?
2.
I divide by half, right? Because it's 1/2 times theta. So then I take the 1/2 and flip, and this becomes 720. So y equals the tangent of 3x. First of all, what's the period of tangent? It's the only one that's different.
It starts with 180. Oh, wait. No, I'm on
Pi. And what do I divide by? 3, so the period is pi over 3. Because,
Oh, divided. Okay.
you got it? Okay, so the first thing we talked about was how tall the graph was. The next one is the period. So for instance, this tangent, instead of making a complete cycle in pi, it's going to make a complete cycle in pi over 3. So it got scrunched down, okay? So the last thing we're going to talk about is phase shift. And phase shift is moving it back and forth. It's when you move the graph back and forth. So it's the horizontal translation because we're smart. So this will tell you how far in what direction, right? It's going to tell you how far to move it and whether I go to the right or to the left. So far we had a number in front. Now we have a number with our period in front of the x. So the last thing we're going to have is going to look like this. So the phase shift is going to be, tell me how far I'm moving it back and forth in which direction. So first of all, what do I know about my x's? They lie, so it's not a minus, it's a positive, and it's a positive pi over 8. So if I have y equals the cosine of x plus pi, the phase shift, which way am I moving this function? Minus pi. Phase shift. Unless you want to write phase shift, I'm going to do A for amplitude, P for period, and PS for phase shift. All right, so what about this one? So first of all, before we write anything, what's the period here? The period comes from the 2. It's tangent, so it's pi over 2, right? So the period is pi over 2. Before I can get the phase shift, though, I have to factor out the 2. So the tangent, I have to take the 2 out, so I get x plus 3. So the phase shift is negative 3. One more. I think you want to see this one. It's not hard. I know, everybody wants to sleep, and we're all excited to go to the gym. And okay, so let me explain, okay? So first of all, let's do the period. Okay, so watch. What's the period, Cassie? So it's 2 pi, and what am I dividing by? What's the number in front of the x?
1/3.
So I'm going to take 2 pi, and I'm going to divide by 1/3. So what happens when you divide by 1/3? And it becomes 6 pi. So 2 times 3 gives you 6 pi. Okay, so you see that? Okay, so that gives me the period because that's the number in front of x. So now I have to find the phase shift. And so I have to divide out my 1/3.
Oh, okay, I got it.
Okay, so some of you, like Cardarius already said the answer, and that was great. But some of you, the 1/3 freaks you out every time, so watch. So I'm dividing the 1/3 by an x. Like, I don't know what number it's going to be, right? So this is how it starts. If you can't do it, if you already got the number in your head, then you don't even have to watch, all right? But if you don't know how to come up with the number, every time, this is what you'll do. You'll put the 1/3, you don't know what the number is, and it has to equal 300. So what do I do to get rid of the 1/3? I'm going to end up multiplying. So what's the number going to end up being? It's 900. When you multiply 300 times 3, you get 900. So this number is 900. So my phase shift is a negative 900. All right, I'm going to give you the assignment, and I'm going to do a couple of them with you to help you get started. No, it's too early to be lazy. Nobody's lazy. We're having fun, and we're learning. Did you hear anything I said today? Where is Ashley? She's sick. Yeah, this is easy. Okay. Okay, so y equals 4 sine of theta. First of all, where does the amplitude come from?
Always positive.
Always positive and in the beginning. Where does the period come from? The number in front of the theta or the x, and the phase shift is the plus or minus number in the x, okay? So first of all, what's the amplitude? 4. So what's the period here?
360.
So it's 360 because it's a theta, so it's in degrees, and there's a 1 in front of it, so it's 360. Do I have a plus or minus? So I have none on the phase shift. Yes. Okay, so y equals, skip 1, go to the y equals 2 cosine 2 theta. So first of all, the amplitude is 2. The period is in degrees or radians? Degrees. So it's 360, and what's the number in front of it? 2. So my period is 180. Do I have a phase shift? If there's a plus or minus. Okay, first of all, amplitude of tangent. There is none. So this is a none. Never. There's never amplitude for tangent. Next, I want the period. So is this going to be in radians or degrees? Radians. So what is the period for tangent? It's pi. And what's the number in front of x? 2. So my period is pi over 2. And so to find the phase shift, I have to factor out the 2. So if I factor out a 2, I get x minus pi over 2. So my phase shift is a positive pi over 2.
Is that for the period? I know, but she put pi over 2.
That's for both. Okay, so is everybody good with that? Okay, on the back. So, you guys, the top is an equation, and it's sine, and the bottom is a cosine. So let's just do the first one together. So sine, that it says in the directions. So the top is sine. So I'm going to get a sign.
Y
So y equals,
equals 5.
right, because that's the amplitude, 5, sine. So the period is 360. Is that the right period?
Yes.
It is the right period. That tells me it's degrees, so do I use theta or x? Theta.
I'm still not going to say that.
Okay, so look, on the
I know what it is, but
okay.
in my mind, I'm just going to keep saying it.
All right, that's okay. Just write it right. So then the phase shift, here it says positive 60. So what's the real answer? And so that's the whole entire thing. Yeah. Okay, so everybody listen on the next one. We'll do it together. So it's a sine function. So I put y equals, the amplitude is 2/3, so I'm going to put 2/3 and the sine. Now, I have a pi, so it's an x. And so what's the period supposed to be, friends? 2 pi. But what do I have here? So I divided by 2. So what's the number in front of the x? No. So, okay. Okay. So if I end up with pi, so what's the formula? What do I start with? So I have 2 pi and I divide it by a number, right? If I divide it by x, and I'm going to end up with pi. So what's the x that I had? 2. So I'm going to have 2, and then I'm going to have x minus pi over 4. Now, so Cardarius, you were correct when you said pi over 8, right? And the reason that you wouldn't write pi over 8 here unless you wrote it this way. And so if this is going to confuse you, don't watch. But I want you, because what you said is correct. So you have to have 2x minus pi over 8. So what you said with the pi over 8 is the unfactored form, okay? And so that is correct, and I would take either answer, okay? But this is correct, okay? So does anybody have any other questions? Yes. It's in the directions, so the top is sine and the bottom is the cosine. And yes, I'll always tell you. You won't have to guess. And also, you guys, you see that 7/3 y? The y is a typo.